Captain Sarah Chen had attended diplomatic functions on 14 different worlds, but the Grand Mating Conclave on Nexus Prime was her first experience with institutionalized romantic politics on an interstellar scale. The event combined the worst aspects of speed dating with the complexity of multi-species treaty negotiations, all conducted in a crystalline hall that could have housed a small city and currently contained enough political tension to power a fusion reactor. Fascinating anthropological study, she murmured to herself, watching as Lord Theron of the Altarian Empire ceremoniously rejected his third potential mate of the evening while maintaining the kind of diplomatic smile that suggested extensive training in polite hostility. Though I'm starting to understand why humans weren't invited to these things until recently. The conclave operated on principles that made perfect sense to species who'd been practicing interstellar politics for millennia and absolutely no sense to anyone who preferred their romantic relationships with less potential for accidentally starting wars. Potential mates were presented in order of social status, with elaborate ceremonies marking each acceptance or rejection, and the entire process was conducted under the watchful eyes of representatives from every major galactic power. Sarah's role as human diplomatic attaché was primarily observational. Humanity was still too new to galactic society to participate in the ancient mating rituals that shaped alliances between star systems. Which was probably for the best, considering that human approaches to romance typically involved significantly less ceremony and considerably more privacy. The entire atmosphere of careful diplomatic choreography shattered the moment Queen Lyrilleth entered the hall. Sarah felt the change before she saw its cause, a sudden hush that spread through the assembled crowd like ripples in disturbed water, conversations dying mid-sentence as hundreds of beings turned to stare at the figure who had just appeared at the hall's ceremonial entrance. Even from across the vast space, Sarah could see why the reaction was so immediate and visceral. Queen Lyrilleth was undeniably beautiful, with the kind of ethereal perfection that suggested her species had evolved aesthetics alongside intelligence. Her skin held a luminescent quality that seemed to glow with inner light, her hair fell like liquid silver around shoulders that carried the bearing of absolute authority, and her ears tapered to elegant points that somehow made her appear both alien and aristocratic. But what made every being in the hall step backward wasn't her beauty. It was the unmistakable aura of predator that surrounded her like a visible force field. The Keitha. Sarah had read the diplomatic briefings, but encountering one in person was entirely different from studying cultural reports. The vampire species was ancient, sophisticated, and absolutely terrifying to every other sentient race in the galaxy for reasons that went far beyond simple prejudice. Queen Lyrilleth moved through the hall with fluid grace, approaching potential suitors with the same diplomatic precision as every other participant. The difference was that her approach sent beings scrambling away from her path as if she were carrying some kind of contagious plague. Lord Commander Vex, she said to a draconian military leader, her voice carrying musical undertones that somehow made her words sound like poetry. I would be honored to discuss the possibility of alliance between our peoples. Lord Commander Vex, whose species had conquered half a dozen star systems through sheer military prowess, took 3 steps backward and stammered something about prior commitments before fleeing toward the refreshment tables. Sarah watched this pattern repeat itself with growing fascination and horror. The Queen maintained perfect composure, her diplomatic smile never wavering, but Sarah was trained to read micro-expressions across multiple species. She could see the carefully controlled pain in Lyrilleth's eyes, the subtle tension in her shoulders that suggested someone holding herself together through sheer force of will. Ambassador Chen, came a voice beside her. Sarah turned to find Director Hayes, the senior human diplomat, wearing an expression of concerned warning. I hope you're taking notes on proper protocol. This is exactly the kind of situation where cultural misunderstandings can create diplomatic incidents. What situation? Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew. Queen Lyrilleth's presence here violates several unwritten but universally understood social conventions. The Keitha are tolerated in galactic politics, but they're not welcomed in situations involving potential intimate contact. Hayes gestured toward the Queen, who was being politely but firmly dismissed by yet another potential suitor. Her species' feeding requirements make other races understandably nervous about close personal relationships. Sarah had read the briefings on Keitha biology. They were psychic vampires who fed on life essence rather than blood, capable of draining the vitality from other sentient beings through skin contact. The process was allegedly controllable and non-fatal when properly managed, but the psychological impact of being fed upon had created fear that transcended rational diplomatic considerations. "Has she actually harmed anyone?" Sarah asked. "Not personally, as far as our intelligence indicates. But her species' reputation is complicated. 2 centuries ago, a plague forced the Keitha to increase their feeding frequency, leading to several incidents where other species were accidentally drained to dangerous levels. The plague has been cured, but the fear remains." Sarah watched Queen Lireleth approach another group of potential suitors, observed the immediate dispersal as beings found urgent reasons to be elsewhere, noted the way the Queen's diplomatic smile never faltered despite the obvious rejection. "She's been alone this entire evening," Sarah observed. "And she'll remain alone. No species in the galaxy is willing to risk intimate contact with a Keitha, regardless of diplomatic benefits. Queen Lireleth's attendance here is largely symbolic, a demonstration that the Sanguine Dominion remains committed to galactic society despite their dietary requirements." Sarah felt something twist in her chest as she watched the Queen stand in the center of the vast hall, surrounded by hundreds of beings who were carefully maintaining maximum distance from her position. The isolation was so complete it seemed almost choreographed, as if everyone had agreed in advance to treat her as a dangerous but necessary presence that must be acknowledged but never approached. "Director," Sarah said slowly, "what would happen if someone did approach her? Hypothetically speaking." Haza's expression shifted to alarm. "Ambassador Chen, I strongly advise against any unauthorized diplomatic contact. The Keitha situation requires extremely careful handling by senior personnel with specific cultural training. But hypothetically, approaching Queen Lireleth would be viewed by other species as either an act of impressive courage or dangerous stupidity. Possibly both." Hayes paused, studying Sarah's expression with growing concern. "Ambassador, please tell me you're not considering doing something that could jeopardize humanity's standing in galactic society." Sarah looked across the hall at Queen Lireleth, who had moved to a position near the ceremonial fountain where she could observe the ongoing mating rituals without making other beings uncomfortable with her proximity. Even from this distance, the Queen's loneliness was so profound it seemed to create its own gravitational field. "I'm considering doing something that might be the right thing to do," Sarah replied. "Regardless of its diplomatic implications." Director Hayes' expression suggested he was already mentally composing incident reports, but Sarah was no longer listening to his warnings. She was watching a being who possessed obvious intelligence, dignity, and grace being systematically excluded from basic social interaction because of fear that might or might not be justified. The diplomatic thing to do would be to maintain safe distance and observe proper protocol. The human thing to do, Sarah realized, might be something entirely different. Sarah spent the next hour conducting what she told herself was diplomatic reconnaissance but what felt increasingly like stalking as she observed Queen Lireleth's interactions with the other conclave attendees. The pattern was consistent and heartbreaking. The Queen would approach a potential conversation partner with perfect diplomatic protocol, engage in precisely the correct cultural greetings, and watch as her target found increasingly creative excuses to terminate the interaction within minutes. "The Keitha feeding cycle operates on a monthly basis," explained Dr. Yevgeny Volkov, the human xenobiologist who'd been dragged to the conclave as a cultural consultant. "They require life essence to maintain their enhanced cognitive and physical capabilities, but the process is highly regulated within their society. Queen Lireleth herself hasn't fed from an unwilling source in over 2 centuries. But the fear remains," Sarah observed, watching the Queen maintain perfect posture despite being systematically excluded from every conversation in her vicinity. "Fear, yes, but also misunderstanding. Most species view Keitha feeding as parasitism, but their own cultural texts describe it as a form of intimate communication. They believe that sharing life essence creates profound emotional and psychic bonds between participants." Volkov paused, consulting his data pad. The Queen's diplomatic records indicate she spent the last 50 years attempting to rebuild her species' reputation through careful diplomacy and cultural exchange programs. 50 years of work, and she still can't find anyone willing to have a normal conversation with her. The psychological impact of extended isolation on Keitha psychology is poorly understood, but preliminary research suggests they require regular social contact to maintain mental stability. Extended rejection and touch avoidance can lead to a catatonic state that may be irreversible. Sarah felt her stomach clench. How extended? The research is limited, but case studies suggest that complete social isolation for more than 60 years can result in permanent psychological withdrawal. Sarah did quick mental math and realized that Queen Lireleth was approaching a psychological cliff that could destroy her entirely. The being she was watching maintain perfect diplomatic composure was slowly dying from loneliness, and everyone in the hall was contributing to her destruction through simple avoidance. Dr. Volkov, what would happen if someone actually made physical contact with her? Assuming she wasn't feeding at the time. Theoretically, brief skin contact with a non-feeding Keitha should be harmless. They have excellent control over their feeding reflexes and can maintain normal physical interaction when not actively drawing life essence. He paused, studying Sarah's expression with growing alarm. But Ambassador Chen, the political implications of unauthorized contact would be significant. I understand. Sarah watched Queen Lireleth gracefully accept another polite dismissal from a group of Centaurian diplomats. But the ethical implications of doing nothing might be worse. Against her better judgment and Director Hayes's increasingly frantic warnings, Sarah began walking toward the Queen's position near the ceremonial fountain. The closer she got, the more apparent it became that Lireleth's composure was costing her enormous effort. Her diplomatic smile was flawless, but her hands trembled slightly when she thought no one was watching, and her luminescent skin seemed dimmer than it had appeared from across the hall. Your Majesty, Sarah said, executing what she hoped was an appropriately formal bow. Captain Sarah Chen, Human Diplomatic Corps. Would you honor me with a moment of conversation? Queen Lireleth turned with fluid grace, and Sarah found herself looking into eyes that held depths of exhaustion, hope, and carefully controlled desperation. Up close, the Queen's beauty was even more striking, but what caught Sarah's attention was the way Lireleth's entire posture changed at the prospect of genuine social interaction. Captain Chen, the Queen replied, her voice carrying harmonics that suggested her species had evolved music alongside language. The honor would be entirely mine. I confess, I was beginning to wonder if the evening would consist entirely of architectural appreciation. Sarah laughed, surprised by the Queen's dry humor. The hall is impressive, though I suspect the designers never intended it to serve as a showcase for advanced avoidance techniques. Indeed. I've learned more about creative exit strategies this evening than in decades of diplomatic training. Lireleth's smile became genuine rather than diplomatic. Your species' reputation for directness appears to be well-founded. We're still learning galactic etiquette. Sometimes directness is the only approach we understand. Sarah gestured toward the ongoing mating ceremonies. Though I have to admit, this entire process seems designed to maximize social complexity. The conclave serves multiple purposes: political alliance formation, cultural exchange, resource negotiation. The romantic elements are simply the most visible aspect of much deeper diplomatic structures. Lireleth paused, studying Sarah's expression. You seem remarkably comfortable conversing with someone the rest of the gathering is treating as a biological hazard. Maybe I haven't been properly educated about the dangers, Sarah replied. Or maybe I think the dangers might be exaggerated. Something shifted in the Queen's expression: surprise, gratitude, and what looked like carefully guarded hope. Captain Chen, may I ask why you chose to approach me? Your diplomatic colleagues seem concerned about such contact. Sarah looked around the hall, noting the way other beings were giving them a wide berth while trying to appear as if they weren't staring at the unprecedented sight of someone voluntarily conversing with the Keitha Queen. Because you've been standing alone for 3 hours while everyone treats you like you're radioactive, and that seemed wrong regardless of political protocols. Sarah met Lyriletha's eyes directly. Also because you're obviously intelligent, articulate, and trying very hard to participate in diplomatic processes that everyone else is systematically excluding you from. You're not concerned about the potential risks of contact with my species. I'm more concerned about the definite risks of treating people like monsters without giving them a chance to prove otherwise. Queen Lyrilleth went very still, and for a moment Sarah wondered if she'd somehow violated crucial cultural protocols. Then the Queen smiled with such radiant gratitude that several nearby beings actually stepped backward. Captain Chen, when was the last time someone treated you as an individual rather than a representative of your species' reputation? Every day, Your Majesty. It's one of the advantages of being human. We're too new to galactic society to have accumulated really impressive prejudices yet. Then perhaps you can understand what it means to be judged entirely by assumptions rather than actions. Lyriletha's voice carried undertones of pain that made Sarah's chest tighten with sympathy. I came to this conclave not seeking romance, but hoping to find even one potential ally who might help bridge the gap between my people and the rest of galactic civilization. Have you found any? Until this moment, no. The fear runs too deep, and the historical incidents have created suspicion that transcends rational evaluation of current circumstances. The Queen paused, watching Sarah's reaction carefully. But your willingness to engage in normal conversation suggests that humanity might possess the flexibility to look beyond surface prejudices. Sarah felt the weight of representing her entire species in this interaction, but also the growing certainty that Queen Lyrilleth deserved better treatment than systematic exclusion and diplomatic isolation. Your Majesty, would you be interested in discussing potential cultural exchange programs between humanity and the Sanguine Dominion? I can't make formal commitments, but I can certainly recommend such discussions to my superiors. The transformation in Queen Lyriletha's expression was immediate and profound. Hope replaced exhaustion, genuine excitement replaced diplomatic composure, and for the first time all evening, she looked like someone who believed the future might hold possibilities beyond endless rejection. Captain Chen, she said softly, I would consider such discussions the most significant diplomatic breakthrough my people have achieved in over a century. As they continued talking, Sarah realized that she was not only enjoying the conversation but learning more about galactic politics and interspecies relations than she had in months of formal briefings. Queen Lyrilleth possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of galactic history, a subtle understanding of complex diplomatic relationships, and a perspective on interspecies cooperation that came from centuries of careful observation from the outside. More importantly, Sarah was beginning to understand that the being everyone feared as a dangerous predator was actually one of the most thoughtful, articulate, and genuinely caring individuals she'd encountered in galactic society. The question was whether that understanding would be enough to overcome centuries of fear and prejudice. And whether her growing attraction to the lonely queen was going to complicate everything even further. Sarah's continued association with Queen Lyrilleth created exactly the kind of diplomatic incident Director Hayes had been dreading, though the fallout proved more complex than simple censure. Within hours of their public conversation, Sarah found herself fielding concerned inquiries from 3 different species ambassadors, 2 formal warnings about unauthorized diplomatic contact, and 1 surprisingly supportive message from the Altarian cultural attaché who apparently admired her willingness to challenge established social conventions. Ambassador Chen, Director Hayes said during their emergency briefing session, I understand your motivations, but your actions have created significant complications for humanity's position in galactic society. Several council members have expressed concern that humans might not fully understand the dangers posed by intimate contact with psychic predator species. With respect, Director, I think the dangers might be significantly overestimated. Sarah consulted her notes from her extended conversation with Queen Lyrilleth. Her Majesty provided extensive information about Ketha feeding practices, their cultural safeguards against unauthorized consumption, and their current diplomatic initiatives. Nothing I learned suggests they pose any threat to willing participants in controlled contact. Willing participants being the operative phrase. The concern is that Ketha feeding creates psychological dependency that compromises informed consent for future interactions. Sarah thought about Queen Lireleth's careful explanations of her species feeding protocols, the elaborate consent rituals that preceded any life essence sharing, the cultural emphasis on mutual benefit rather than parasitic consumption. Director, have you actually read the Keitha cultural documentation, or are you relying on second-hand reports from species who've had minimal direct contact? Hayes's expression suggested he was beginning to realize that Sarah had done considerably more research than anticipated. The official diplomatic position is based on comprehensive intelligence reports from intelligence agencies that consider the Keitha a potential threat rather than diplomatic partners. Your Majesty mentioned that most of the negative reports about her species come from military assessments rather than cultural studies. You discussed classified intelligence reports with an alien head of state. I discussed publicly available research with someone who spent 2 centuries trying to correct misconceptions about her people's intentions and capabilities. Sarah paused, recognizing that she was defending Queen Lireleth with more passion than diplomatic protocol recommended. Director, what if the fear is based on incomplete information? Before Hayes could respond, alarms began sounding throughout the diplomatic compound. Through the conference room's transparent walls, Sarah could see security personnel moving with the kind of urgent precision that suggested immediate threats rather than routine precautions. Security Alert Level 3, announced the facility's AI system. All diplomatic personnel report to designated safe zones immediately. Hayes activated his emergency communication system, his expression shifting from administrative annoyance to genuine concern. Command, this is Director Hayes. What's the nature of the threat? Director, we have reports of hostile confrontation in the main conclave hall. Lord Vorthak of the Draconian Military Consortium has issued formal challenge protocols regarding Queen Lireleth's presence at the gathering. The situation is escalating toward potential violence. Sarah felt her stomach drop as she realized that her conversation with the Queen might have triggered exactly the kind of diplomatic crisis she'd been hoping to prevent. Director, I need to get to the conclave hall. Absolutely not. You're confined to the diplomatic compound until this situation is resolved. Director, if Lord Vorthak is threatening Queen Lireleth because of her association with me, then I have a responsibility to. You have a responsibility to follow orders and avoid making the situation worse. Hayes gestured toward the security feeds displaying the main hall, where a crowd had gathered around what appeared to be a heated confrontation. Ambassador Chen, your unauthorized contact with the Keitha Queen has already created complications we're still trying to understand. Adding your presence to an active conflict zone would be diplomatically catastrophic. Through the security feeds, Sarah could see Queen Lireleth standing with perfect composure while Lord Vorthak, a massive draconian whose species had evolved from apex predators, gestured aggressively and drew what appeared to be substantial support from other warrior caste representatives. The Queen was outnumbered, isolated, and facing beings whose military capabilities far exceeded her own. She's alone, Sarah said, watching the confrontation escalate. Everyone who was avoiding her before is now actively supporting her opposition. The Keitha have excellent defensive capabilities. Queen Lireleth can protect herself against multiple opponents who've been looking for an excuse to eliminate what they see as a threat to galactic security. Sarah felt growing certainty that diplomatic protocol was about to become secondary to basic moral responsibility. Director, someone is going to get hurt, and it's going to be the person who spent all evening trying to engage in peaceful diplomacy while everyone else treated her like a biological weapon. The security feeds showed the confrontation intensifying, with Lord Vorthak's aggressive posturing drawing cheers from supporters while Queen Lireleth maintained defensive positioning that suggested she was preparing for violence she couldn't avoid. Ambassador Chen, Hayes said firmly, you are ordered to remain in this compound. That is not a request. Sarah looked at the feeds showing Queen Lireleth facing hostility that had escalated far beyond simple social rejection, then at Director Hayes, who was prioritizing diplomatic safety over individual responsibility. Director, with respect, some orders require individual moral evaluation. Ambassador, if you leave this compound, you'll be acting without authorization and jeopardizing your entire diplomatic career. Sarah thought about Queen Lyriletha's grateful smile when someone had finally treated her as an individual rather than a monster, about the loneliness that was slowly killing her, about the courage it had taken to attend the conclave despite knowing she would face rejection and hostility. "Then I guess I'll have to find a new career," she said, heading for the compound's exit despite Haza's increasingly urgent protests. By the time Sarah reached the main conclave hall, the confrontation had evolved into a formal challenge that threatened to tear apart the entire gathering. Lord Vorthak had demanded Queen Lyriletha's immediate expulsion from the conclave, claiming that predator species had no right to participate in civilized mating rituals. Several other species had voiced support for his position, while a smaller faction argued that excluding the Keitha would set dangerous precedents for diplomatic discrimination. Queen Lyrileth stood in the center of the growing chaos, maintaining dignified composure while facing hostility that had moved far beyond simple prejudice into open hatred. "The Keitha presence contaminates this gathering," Lord Vorthak declared, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command. "Their feeding requirements make them incompatible with intimate alliance formation. They should be excluded from events involving potential physical contact." Lord Vorthak, Queen Lyrileth replied with perfect diplomatic calm, "The Sanguine Dominion's participation in this conclave has been formally approved by the Galactic Council. My presence here follows all established protocols. Protocols that fail to account for the psychological impact of psychic predation on potential partners," Vorthak countered. "No sentient being should be required to risk consciousness violation for diplomatic purposes." Sarah pushed through the crowd, noting the way other beings instinctively moved away from Queen Lyriletha's position while clustering around Lord Vorthak's increasingly aggressive stance. "Lord Vorthak," she called out, her voice carrying across the hall with the kind of authority that stopped conversations. "Are you arguing that fear should determine diplomatic policy?" The draconian military leader turned toward her with the expression of someone who just discovered an interesting new target. "Captain Chen. How appropriate that humanity's representative chooses to defend the galaxy's most dangerous predator species. I'm defending someone who spent all evening trying to engage in peaceful diplomacy while being systematically excluded from basic social interaction," Sarah replied, moving to stand beside Queen Lyrileth despite the gasps of shock from the surrounding crowd. "And I'm questioning whether prejudice based on fear is an appropriate foundation for galactic policy." Lord Vorthak's smile revealed teeth evolved for tearing flesh. "Perhaps humans are simply naive about the dangers posed by consciousness parasites. Perhaps draconians are simply uncomfortable with species who possess capabilities they don't understand," Sarah shot back. The hall went dead silent, and Sarah realized she'd just publicly insulted a military leader whose species could probably dismember her without breaking stride. But Queen Lyrileth was no longer standing alone, and sometimes that mattered more than personal safety. The silence that followed Sarah's challenge to Lord Vorthak stretched across the hall like a held breath, broken only by the soft harmonic tones of the ceremonial crystals responding to the elevated emotional tension. Sarah could feel hundreds of beings staring at the unprecedented sight of a human diplomat defending the galaxy's most feared predator species against one of its most respected military leaders. "Captain Chen," Lord Vorthak said slowly, his voice carrying the kind of dangerous calm that preceded either violence or retreat, "are you prepared to stake humanity's diplomatic standing on your defense of consciousness parasites?" "I'm prepared to stake my personal reputation on defending someone who's been judged guilty of crimes she's never committed," Sarah replied, acutely aware that Queen Lyrileth had gone very still beside her. "Lord Vorthak, has Queen Lyrileth actually threatened anyone here tonight? Has she made any aggressive moves, violated any protocols, or given any indication that she poses a danger to this gathering? Her mere presence constitutes a threat. Her mere presence constitutes participation in a diplomatic event she has every right to attend." Sarah felt her diplomatic training warring with her growing anger at the systematic persecution she was witnessing. "Unless you're arguing that fear alone is sufficient justification for exclusion from galactic society." Murmurs rippled through the crowd as other beings began to process the implications of Sarah's argument. If fear could justify excluding the Keitha from diplomatic gatherings, the same logic could be applied to any species that made others uncomfortable. The feeding requirements of psychic vampires create inherent risks, Lord Vorthak began. That can be managed through proper protocols and informed consent, Queen Lireleth interjected quietly. Risks that are significantly lower than those posed by species with histories of military aggression. The pointed reference to draconian military expansion triggered a wave of uncomfortable shifting among the gathered beings, and Sarah realized that Queen Lireleth had just demonstrated the kind of diplomatic precision that came from centuries of careful observation. Your Majesty raises an interesting point, Sarah continued, recognizing an opportunity to reframe the entire confrontation. If we're discussing inherent dangers posed by different species' biological requirements, perhaps we should examine all potentially threatening capabilities rather than focusing exclusively on the Keitha. Lord Vorthak's expression darkened as he realized the direction of her argument. Human naivety does not constitute effective diplomatic strategy. Human fairness might constitute better diplomatic strategy than military intimidation, Sarah shot back. Lord Vorthak, you're demanding the exclusion of someone who's never harmed anyone here, while simultaneously threatening violence against anyone who opposes your demands. Which behavior actually threatens this gathering's safety? The crowd's reaction shifted palpably as beings began to recognize the hypocrisy Sarah was highlighting. Lord Vorthak was using aggression to argue against the presence of someone whose only crime was belonging to a species that made others nervous. Captain Chen, came a new voice from the crowd. Ambassador Thrix of the Centaurian Republic stepped forward with the careful bearing of someone attempting diplomatic mediation. While your defense of Queen Lireleth is admirable, the concerns about Keitha feeding practices are based on documented historical incidents. Incidents that occurred during a plague that ended 2 centuries ago, Queen Lireleth replied calmly. Ambassador Thrix, are you arguing that my species should be permanently excluded from galactic society based on emergency actions taken during a medical crisis that no longer exists? Sarah felt a sudden inspiration that was either brilliant or completely insane. Your Majesty, Ambassador Thrix, Lord Vorthak, what if we could demonstrate definitively that modern Keitha feeding practices pose no threat to willing participants? How? Several voices asked simultaneously. Sarah took a deep breath, knowing that what she was about to propose would either resolve the crisis or destroy her diplomatic career entirely. Through direct demonstration. I volunteer to undergo the Keitha bonding ritual with Queen Lireleth. The hall erupted in shocked gasps, urgent whispers, and what sounded like several beings choking on their ceremonial beverages. Queen Lireleth went completely still, her luminescent skin paling to almost transparent. Captain Chen, she said softly, you don't understand what you're offering. The bonding ritual involves complete life essence sharing. It could alter your physiology permanently, making you incompatible with your own species. The risks are significantly less than the risk of allowing fear and prejudice to determine galactic policy, Sarah interrupted. Your Majesty, if the ritual is as safe as you claim, and if Keitha feeding is truly based on mutual benefit rather than parasitism, then a public demonstration should resolve all doubts. Lord Vorthak's laugh was harsh and disbelieving. Captain Chen, you're proposing to let a psychic vampire feed on your life essence in front of hundreds of witnesses. Are you completely insane? I'm proposing to prove that everything you've said about the Keitha is based on fear rather than facts. Sarah turned to address the entire gathering. If Queen Lireleth's people are the dangerous predators you claim, then this ritual will expose that threat. If they're not, then we'll have proof that our prejudices are preventing beneficial relationships with a valuable ally. And if the process kills you? Ambassador Thrix asked. Then you'll have evidence that the fears are justified. But if it doesn't, if the ritual actually demonstrates the kind of consciousness sharing that Queen Lireleth has described, then perhaps it's time to reconsider our assumptions about what constitutes threat versus opportunity. Queen Lireleth moved closer to Sarah, her expression carrying profound concern and something that looked like awe. Captain Chen, the bonding ritual is irreversible. Once completed, we would share a permanent psychic connection. You would gain some Keitha capabilities, but you might also lose some human characteristics. Are you certain you understand what you're proposing? Sarah looked into Queen Lyriletha's eyes. Ancient, intelligent, filled with centuries of loneliness and hope, and realized that her answer would determine not just her own future, but possibly the future of human-Keitha relations for generations. Your Majesty, I understand that some decisions transcend personal safety. I understand that courage sometimes requires accepting risk for the sake of greater good. And I understand that you've spent centuries waiting for someone to see you as a person rather than a monster. Sarah extended her hand toward the Queen. I can't think of a better cause for taking a leap of faith. The Queen's eyes filled with tears that sparkled like liquid starlight. Captain Chen, no one has willingly touched me in over 50 years. The gesture alone means more than you can possibly understand. Then let's make it count for something bigger than just a gesture. The bonding ritual, conducted under the intense scrutiny of hundreds of galactic representatives, proved to be unlike anything Sarah had imagined. Instead of the draining, parasitic process that Lord Vorthak had described, the life essence sharing felt like the most intimate conversation possible, consciousness touching consciousness, sharing experiences and perspectives that transcended individual identity while somehow enhancing rather than diminishing both participants. Through their connection, Sarah experienced Queen Lyriletha's memories, centuries of careful diplomacy rejected by fear, the profound loneliness of being the only member of her species capable of interacting safely with other sentients, the desperate hope that someday someone would see past her people's reputation to their actual intentions. But she also experienced the Queen's deep compassion, her genuine desire to help other species, her careful control over abilities that could be used to harm but were instead directed toward healing and understanding. In return, Lyrileth experienced Sarah's human perspective, the species' natural curiosity about other forms of consciousness, their capacity for rapid adaptation and acceptance of new ideas, their tendency to judge individuals rather than entire species based on reputation alone. The process enhanced rather than diminished both of them. Sarah felt her awareness expand, gaining sensitivity to emotional undercurrents and psychic resonances she'd never noticed before. Lyrileth seemed to gain something equally valuable, a connection to someone who saw her as an individual rather than a threat, the first genuine friendship she'd experienced in decades. When the ritual concluded, Sarah remained completely herself, but with additional capabilities that felt natural rather than alien. More importantly, the psychic connection with Queen Lyrileth felt like the most positive relationship she'd ever experienced, mutual understanding and respect that transcended species boundaries. Remarkable, Ambassador Thrick said, consulting his bioscanners. Captain Chen, your life signs indicate enhancement rather than depletion. The energy transfer appears to have been genuinely beneficial for both participants. Lord Vorthak's expression suggested he was rapidly recalculating his entire strategic position. The demonstration proves only that individual Keitha may be capable of controlled feeding. It doesn't address the broader security concerns. It proves that our fears were based on incomplete information, Sarah interrupted, still feeling the warm glow of her connection with Queen Lyrileth. Lord Vorthak, everything you claimed about consciousness parasitism and psychological violation has been demonstrated to be false. The Keitha aren't predators, they're potential partners in forms of consciousness exploration that could benefit all species. The transformation in the gathering's atmosphere was immediate and dramatic. Beings who had been maintaining careful distance from Queen Lyrileth began approaching with genuine curiosity rather than fear. The successful bonding had not only vindicated the Queen but established a new model for interspecies relations based on evidence rather than assumption. Captain Chen, Queen Lyrileth said softly, her mental voice warm with gratitude and affection through their new connection, you have given me something I thought was impossible, proof that acceptance and understanding are achievable. Your Majesty, Sarah replied, both aloud and through their psychic link, you've given me something equally valuable. Perspective on consciousness and connection that my species is going to find fascinating. 3 months later, the first human Keitha cultural exchange station was operational, with Sarah serving as the primary liaison and Queen Lyrileth as the Sanguine Dominion's ambassador to humanity. Their bonding had not only resolved the diplomatic crisis but created a new model for interspecies cooperation that was being studied and replicated throughout galactic society. Ready for today's consciousness sharing workshop? Queen Lireleth asked, reviewing their schedule while Sarah calibrated the psychic resonance equipment that now filled their joint laboratory. Always, Sarah replied, both through speech and their permanent mental connection. Though I still find it amazing that we're teaching other species to overcome their fears through direct experience rather than theoretical discussion. I find it amazing that someone was brave enough to touch my hand when everyone else was afraid to be in the same room, Lireleth said, her mental voice warm with love and gratitude that had grown deeper over their months of partnership. Sarah pulled her close, marveling at how their initial act of courage had transformed into something far more profound than either had anticipated. You know what I find amazing? What? That the loneliest being in the galaxy turned out to be the perfect partner for someone who'd never experienced real connection until she learned to share consciousness with an alien vampire queen. Their kiss carried psychic harmonics that their monitoring equipment registered as perfect emotional resonance between human curiosity and Keitha wisdom, and Sarah realized that sometimes the most important diplomatic breakthroughs happen not in treaty negotiations, but in the simple act of reaching out to touch someone everyone else was afraid to acknowledge.